I'm Sue Friedrich. I am a filmmaker. I've lived in New York since 1976, and since 1978 I've been making films. So I've made a lot of different films, and I guess I'm just talking to you because my newest film is showing at Film Forum next week.
And that film is called Gut Renovation, and it was world premiered at the Brooklyn Film Festival about a year ago, which is where I first saw the film and was absolutely blown away by it, I have to tell you, because it's so related to what my community here in the West Village has been going through, is what your community in Williamsburg. We'll talk about the film, but first I just want to say I was surprised when I saw this film, because I do know almost all of your work, which is very intimate, sort of personal, told from the worldview of the filmmaker, but more so than normal narrative films. It as a girl, as a woman, as a partner, as a lesbian. This world has been what you've shared with so many people, and because of the quality of the work, you've been so rewarded. I mean, with festival showings and MoMA, and really the kind of reception that every young filmmaker would like to have.
It's true.
You now teach?
I do. I teach at Princeton. I teach film production at Princeton.
At Princeton.
Yeah. And maybe I should say something about this film being a little different than the other work. I mean, I think it is and it isn't, because for one thing, I made a film in 2002 called The Odds of Recovery, which was about my medical issues, and that was a documentary, but a slightly unconventional documentary, and I hope that it moved a little bit outside of my personal experience to talk about Western medicine, Eastern medicine, you know. And then I made a film in 2007 called From the Ground Up about coffee, which again wasn't about me loving to drink coffee. It was about how coffee gets made, and I wanted to really go out into the world and observe this process from start to finish. So in a way, when I started thinking about making Gut Renovation, I was very driven by the fear of losing my own home. You know, we had this beautiful place that we'd lived in for 20 years. We had roommates who we loved who were also going to lose their place. So that was a large part of my impetus in being aware of what was going on around me. But it was such a big story. I mean, it was the entire neighborhood. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to lose our apartment. So what I did was I went out into the neighborhood, but as it went along, it became, let's say, more and more of a personal story, because we were threatened and then we did have to leave, and, so I was recording inside, but a lot of it was outside. And
well, what really interests me about this film and about the two others that you reference is that, unlike Michael Moore, who sort of changed the genre of documentary filmmaking by making himself the center of attention no matter what was going on outside, you integrate the outside and the inside in a way that is pretty unique, I think, in documentary filmmaking. And in Gut Renovation, you are front and center, because it's your home.
Right.
It's where you live, and it's your neighborhood. We're talking about Williamsburg, which was a working class residential neighborhood, and a lot of businesses, a lot of people worked in that neighborhood right across the river from Soho in essence. And in 2005, there was a zoning change that the mayor and the speaker, Christine Quinn, pushed through city council, which uprooted and completely transformed your neighborhood. Could you talk about how you learned about it, and then...
Yeah, well, we learned about it by going to the deli in the morning and buying the paper and seeing the banner headline that said, Williamsburg, Greenpoint rezoning, passes the city council, whatever the wording was. And, they don't use banner headlines very often. This was a big deal. And so it's not as if we didn't know something was afoot. But I would say, personally, I hadn't been going to every community board meeting and reading all the, behind-the-scenes reports about what was being planned. And so even though we had a sense that something really serious was going to happen, I didn't know until that morning the extent of it, that this blanket rezoning was going to go into effect and what the ramifications were. So it was very shocking.
Who was your city council person at that time? Do you remember?
I don't. I think David Yaski is a name that he was around a lot. Oh my goodness.
Well, the point
Somebody else.
is that the city council person had not gone to his or her constituents and said, this is what we're planning, how do you feel about it?
Well, I have to be careful about misspeaking, since I'm not, since I wasn't involved in the local community work that was being done, but from 1998 to 2002, local people in the community board, members of NAG, Neighbors Against Garbage, which turned into Neighbors Allied for Good Growth, which was a very good group that was trying to preserve Williamsburg, and also members of groups from the south side like El Puente, from the Hispanic community, had been working to draft a plan which was called 197A, to say, okay, this is what Williamsburg needs. And it's like a 125-page detailed plan for about every aspect of the neighborhood from the inside. Like, we live here, this is what would make it better for us.
Very much like the Coney Island experience, where the people in Coney Island did the same process and gathered together the information and gave a plan to the city and the city planning board, and all of which was ignored.
Exactly. Yeah. And the thing is, how can they ignore this stuff? How can they look at what the people in the neighborhood need and say, oh, well, we have a better idea, and then just go ahead and do it? So basically, they submitted this in 2002, it passed the city council, and then 3 years later, this completely different plan went through. And in the 2005 rezoning, one of the things that was promised was like 54 acres of parkland. There were certain concessions that they made to
those
the
concessions.
community. Yeah, like certain percentage of affordable housing, parkland, whatever. And here we are in 2013, 8 years later, with NAG and El Puente and these other groups, still trying to get that parkland, still trying to ensure that when new buildings are built, there's affordable housing. And it's just, it's a fight against...
Has there been any affordable housing built in this?
A little, not very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Looking back now, who do you hold responsible for this? And I'm really asking about who in power do you hold responsible? You said that City Council passed this plan in 2002, which would have made the neighborhood feel they're listening to us, they're hearing us.
Right. I don't know. I don't know that I can name individuals. I mean, I certainly name Bloomberg, big time, and all sorts of other people in the city council. But I think it's such a spider's nest of all these people: the developers, landlords, the politicians, people with just tons of money who are working behind the scenes. And one of the things I didn't put in the film because I'd read it back in 2006 and sort of forgotten about it in the course of amassing so much information. And I was rereading these papers after I finished the film, and in one story from the Times, early on after the rezoning, it said that 70% of the land available at the time of the rezoning in Williamsburg was owned by 5 developers.
Now, there's one of the stories, we're going to talk more specifically about the film. I just want to background a little bit here. One of the things that you hear, is that the Orthodox Jewish community owned all of the property that on the waterfront, and that they very much profited from the sale of these warehouses, basically. But they didn't invade their own community space. Because I was walking around Williamsburg the other night, and I found myself suddenly, by going on the wrong street, in a completely Orthodox community.
Right. I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, there's a different story, or let's say a related story that I didn't tell, about the incredible developments on the far south side of Williamsburg by the Hasidic community. So basically in my film, I start at the top of McCarran Park and I go to the BQE, South 5th. I start at the river and I go over to the BQE. And the vast developments by the Hasidic community are all below the BQE. And there is a long, complicated story about the relationship between the Hasidic community and the Hispanic community, about getting, HUD contracts for building, around there. And that goes back to the 70s and 80s, and I did not feel that I knew enough or was in the position to tell that story. Okay. So I basically left it aside. But there were certainly Hasidic developers putting up buildings on the north side. I don't know the numbers, how many were Hasidic, how many were Protestant. I think there was a mixture of developers, certainly some Hasidic, but a lot of others.
Were there, it's been said that this town is really run by 7 families, the 7 real estate families, and they control everything that happens. Were any of those quote-unquote 7 families involved in the development and purchase of the 70% of the land in Williamsburg that you're aware of?
I don't know. This is the kind of thing that now I want to find out about, and I'll let you know, but I suspect that's the case. Certainly, the family that owned the Domino Sugar Factory is, huge landholders, but I don't know exactly.
All right, let's go back.
Maybe I should. I don't know.
Why did you move to Williamsburg?
Well, I moved to Williamsburg because of another case of takeover, which was that my partner's former girlfriend was living in a loft in downtown Brooklyn with 2 other artists, with Billy Basinski, a musician, and James Elaine.
Oh,
yeah,
I love him.
Yeah, and James Elaine, an artist, and Chase Bank came in and said, "Well, the block is ours," and they bought out everybody on the block. And so Billy and James had to find a new place to live, and we knew people. We all knew people who were moving to Williamsburg at that point. Sort of, I had friends who moved there in 1985. So there was a bit of a trickle, and so Billy and James found this building, and then Martina also needed to move, and Kathy was living in a terrible apartment on 14th between A and B, and I was living in a fairly crummy apartment down in Chinatown. And so we thought, well, Billy and James got 1 floor and we'll take the other floor. So it was very, infuriating what Chase was doing to them at first, but then, to me, the consequence was finding this beautiful old building and being able to live there for 20 years.
Are you sad you didn't buy it?
There was no option to buy.
It
was a commercial building. It was owned by kind of shadow family trust of some kind.
Those family trusts.
Those family trusts. So we rented it through Kelman Dolgen, who had allegedly leased it for 20 years. And it had been abandoned for 20 years also, so we didn't displace, any manufacturer in moving in. And that maybe happens sometimes in other buildings, but in our case, we moved in, and we then paid for everything for 20 years. We paid all utilities, water, sewer, we paid the real estate taxes and rent. So basically these people owned this building and spent nothing for 20. Even the tenant who lived on the top floor, Ruth Kahn, who was an artist and ran this great facility called Outpost Editing, which she made it, very affordable for people to come in and work. And she spent, I think, $15,000 of her own money fixing the roof and building a deck on the roof. I mean, they just did nothing in the building.
This is not an unusual story, though, with artists going into these decrepit neighborhoods or basic business neighborhoods that are dead at night.
Right.
How did the neighborhood, the people that lived there, a lot of immigrant sort of families, the old Polish people, etc., look upon these new artist people moving in sort of non-traditional family situations?
Right. My general feeling was that we were welcome. I think there were times when we might have seemed a bit much for, maybe a conservative Catholic Polish family or Italian family. But my sense was at the beginning that we were very much a part of the neighborhood. There were 2 restaurants in the entire neighborhood. There were these little delis and grocery stores, and that's where we shopped, and we got our hair cut on Bedford Avenue, and this and that. So I feel like we were supporting local businesses, and people were grateful about that. And I know the man named Mike, who ran the grocery store called Tops on 6th. It was a kind of funky grocery store. It was just sort of your basic kind of C-town grocery store. But he really believed in his grocery store, and he would always say to us, what do you want? What do you want? What should I get? And he really believed in organic vegetables. This is back in like the early 90s. And he was from the islands, and he knew what good food was. And so he kept adding things to the grocery store, and it was a fantastic grocery store. And one of the really telling things in the, let's say, like late 90s, early 2000s, when we felt that, you know, things were just getting out of control, was I would be on the subway, and I would see people with bags from Whole Foods. They were going into town, maybe to work, and they were shopping at Whole Foods and coming home instead of going to Tops. And I thought, well, the joke's on you. He's got more organic vegetables than Whole Foods does.
And I bet they were cheaper.
But this, you know, this feeling like, oh, it isn't good enough in the neighborhood yet. We need to, you know, have our stuff from Manhattan.
So here you are in 2005, living in a whole floor of a loft in a warehouse building in Williamsburg, and Billy is living downstairs.
They were upstairs.
Upstairs. Yeah. How many people were living in your space?
Well, we had 3,500 square feet.
Woo.
With, you know, floor-to-ceiling windows all along the front, and then there was an inner area on our level that we were able to turn into a garden, which was like 20 by 60 or 80 feet. It was huge.
Was this under the AIR regulations, artisan residence?
Not exactly, but what happened was when we moved in, we met the people who had the sublease, who were renting to us, and they knew that we were living there. And this is typical in the neighborhood. The landlords knew that people were living in places that were zoned not for living. And so there we did. We made bedrooms, we put beds in, blah, blah, blah. And then at the 10-year mark, when they tried to double our rent, we got together, we took them to court, and we knew that one of the arguments they were going to make was that either we had to pay this much because we were commercial, and that was that, because there's no protection for commercial leases, leaseholders, or they were going to try to throw us out on the basis that we were living there. And Billy, thank God, had a tape recorder on at the very first meeting when they signed the lease with the guy, and in it he says something to the effect of living. And so in court we just said, well, the landlord was perfectly aware that we were living there. So
let's just put Billy into the picture for a moment. Billy is an artist who works a lot with ambient sound, and so it's I brought a smile to my face when you said that he had his tape recorder on. Word to the wise, by the way.
Exactly.
Always record them. So how many people living in? You said you had roommates.
So we had 3,500 square feet, and we set it up so that there were the bedrooms were all about 400 square feet, and then
400 square feet. I want that for people that live in 265.
An entire apartment.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, 400 square feet just for the bedroom. Huge 400 square foot living room. Dining room, same thing, dining room, kitchen, and then there were 2 spaces for studios, one for me and one for Kathy, because we were the leaseholders, and the way the space was divided, we couldn't create more studio space, but we often, we lived with a lot of different roommates, and we often had painters or, you know, people who did drawing or film or whatever, who lived with us, who had enough space in their room to work also. So, yes. And then also Kathy, my partner who's a painter, created a museum called the Temporary Museum of Painting and Drawing, and we ran that for about 4 years. And
in the space?
In the space, and it was really great, because it was, she changed the shows every 2 months, and we had a lot of events also. We even had like a CD release party when our friends are in a group called Les Chaux Lapins, and we had a CD release party for them, and it was kind of like a salon for all the artists who lived in the neighborhood.
You know, it reminds me of some of the warehouse collectives that in San Francisco had taken over. You go to Amsterdam or Berlin, you see the same kind of thing.
Right.
Or you see it maybe in Detroit, burnt out Detroit, or places, but you don't see this very much anymore in New York City.
No.
We used to have those kinds of things. So
In Bushwick, it's still hanging on. Bushwick is
for
hanging on
for a moment.
Right. I mean,
When
what's going to
did you
happen to New York?
Pardon?
What's going to happen to New York as the art capital of the world if this keeps going on?
Well, this is one of the questions that your film raises, and I'd like to put that aside for a moment.
Sure.
I'd like to know when you decided to pick up the camera.
late 2005, because within such a short time after the rezoning, it became apparent that this was going to happen on a really huge scale. You know, you would see a hole in the ground where there had been a building just, a couple weeks before. And so I thought, I better get on this quickly. And so, yeah, I started going out with my camera.
And what kind of camera did you use?
I used a Panasonic standard def video camera, and a shotgun mic, pretty basic equipment.
I love the way you sort of did the Pennybaker, Bob Dylan sort of takeoff by numbering the buildings. You started with 1 and you ended with 173. In how long a period of time?
Well, the last shooting I did was in 2010, but I would say I captured most of the footage between 2006 and 2008, because the bulk of the teardowns happened then because the tax breaks and the way the law worked. So people needed to, as they call it, drive the pile before a certain date in 2008 in order to get the tax breaks. So and then of course there was the economic meltdown. So what happened is all these people tore these things down so they could get the tax breaks, and then the crash happened, and that put a halt to a lot of the building, but then of course it picked up again, and now it's going
and all those
gangbusters.
Tax breaks carried over.
Right.
For people that don't know the actual geography, your film is very revealing about how zoning and development, which could be good for some neighborhoods would be seen as good things, absolutely destroyed Williamsburg for what it was. And your film seems to have two storylines. It has the outside storyline of all of the devastation, the building, the destruction, the complete transformation of the neighborhood from warehouses to luxury housing, essentially. And the other is the story of your loft and your friends and your relationships. And I wondered how, if you care to share, how it impacted you and Kathy, for example. I mean, this is going on all the time. Or your roommates, your family that you had created.
Right, yeah. It had a really serious impact. I mean, the roommates felt very vulnerable at the thought of losing the place they lived in and loved, and at the time we were seeing what was happening, thinking about leaving. 2 of them had lived with us for a while already. One was more recent, and they kind of looked to us to protect them. Like, are you going to leave soon? Are we going to lose? And so it was, incumbent on us to keep reassuring them and saying, no, our lease is up, in 2009. We're going to hang on, and we're going to do what we can, and maybe if we find a new place, it might work out that you can move in with us. So we had that sort of parental responsibility towards them, and that was kind of heavy. And also, Kathy and I are different, and we took a very different approach to what was happening. And because I chose to make the film, got very busy. I was always like running around with my map and saying, okay, I'm going to go out because I saw that 80 Metropolitan is going up and I got to get that footage. And, and so
Did that distance you from the emotional impact of it?
I think my anger and also just my practical need to record things kept me, not really on the surface, but kept me engaged in the neighborhood in a very particular way for those years. And then when we knew we had to leave, I became much more involved than Kathy in looking for a new place and all of that. And she just kept saying, I mean, not that she was completely withdrawn, but she just kept saying,
This is awful.
I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And I realized later that it was because she was going through this process of grief by herself in her studio. This is such a tremendous loss, and I just have to deal with it in my own way. And sometimes I would say to her, oh, you're just in denial. We have, she kept saying, oh, maybe we'll be able to keep the place. They passed this loft law. Maybe we can stay, blah, blah, blah. And then, we moved. I was sitting in my editing room in my new place 2.5 years after we had left. I'm looking at this footage of the building, the green building across from us being torn down, and I start sobbing uncontrollably. And I thought, wow, that was a painful experience. And now I'm kind of, catching up to it. So, and I think it was very, very sad for our roommates also. And people who had lived with us years before. When I showed it at the Brooklyn Film Festival, people came out of the woodwork, so to speak. Somebody I'd lived with, 15 years before came up and said, oh God, to see the footage of that building. People were very attached to it. And in the neighborhood in general, people were very attached.
This I know from the St. Vincent's battle here. It was mostly older people, because older people, seniors, are close, need hospitals more than young 20s who think they're invulnerable and will never need a hospital. And and when we lost, after fighting very hard, and not one single politician ever showed up or ever said anything, and not one Democratic club ever took a vote on it because of basically the Quinn machine was in place downtown. But afterwards, how people dealt with it. Either they stopped dead cold and wouldn't talk about it, which is from the AIDS crisis. I remember if you put everything in, it still lives there. It still lives there. Or they would get really angry, inappropriately, just any time that they could get really angry at whoever was walking down the street that they thought was responsible, which that kind of thing. And I think people don't understand the impact when you lose your home, you lose your neighborhood. I mean, you talked about the diversity of groups that were working from '98 to 2002, and then came together again to stop this. Where the class and ethnic differences, how were they overcome? Here are the artists that come in, who traditionally have gentrified neighborhoods, not intentionally, but have traditionally gone in and we, at least in New York City, we know, and then they become real estate, markets. So how?
I don't know how to answer this, and actually I was thinking recently, because people have said and I have a bit of that in the film. Well, it's all the fault of the artists, and I thought, Park Slope was completely gentrified without a single artist moving in. I mean, obviously there's artists that live in Park Slope, but that was a process of gentrification that did not involve the sort of grungy artists, so, whatever, moving in. So I think it's a kind of complicated narrative from neighborhood to neighborhood. And again, I can't speak for anybody but myself, and let's say my partner or my best friends, but my sense of moving into Williamsburg was not that different than when I moved to Chinatown or any other neighborhood I've lived in New York, which is that I move where I can, because I'm a working artist, I don't have a lot of money, I need to live somewhere and work. But I'm interested in the neighborhood I move into. I appreciate the neighborhood. If I'm in Chinatown, I ate nothing but Chinese food for 12 years when I lived in Chinatown. I wasn't running up to the East Village to eat. And, when I moved to Williamsburg, I went to the Polish restaurants. I shopped at the grocery store that was run by the Arab guys. I went to the grocery store run by the guy from the Caribbean. I went to the, hairdresser, the Mexican woman who ran the hair salon. It was like my neighborhood, and the people who lived in it and worked in it were, what I appreciated and used for my needs. And there's the Manhattan Avenue is just north of the park, and it's a very typical, for New York, a very typical shopping area. So whether you're in, Flatbush and it's Caribbean, or you're in Queens and it's, Indian or wherever, there's sort of the street of the, sort of inexpensive clothing stores, food, da-da-da-da. And so Manhattan Avenue was like the Polish version of that. I loved it. I went there all the time. And I would mention, when people started moving in the neighborhood and I would talk about, where I went, I would mention it and they'd be like, oh. And I think the people who are moving in later, they would never dream of using the amenities that existed in the neighborhood and were okay for the people who lived in the neighborhood at the time.
And as a same-sex couple, that kind of integration also sort of helped people to see you as neighbors rather than those people over there that are lesbians or
Right. Well, yeah, and we had some funny, like there was a really nice guy who worked at one of the delis, and he was Palestinian. And early on, one time we were talking about politics, and something came up about being gay, and I mean, Kathy and I are totally out. And he started saying some shit about, what we think. And we got into a big argument, and then a couple of other people who were shopping sort of came over, and we got into this big discussion, and that really broke the ice. And for years after, we were very friendly, and sometimes we would talk again about it. And so I always felt like there was a possibility for conversation. I never treated myself like an outsider. I never thought, oh, I'm not Polish, I don't belong here. I just felt like I'm part of this neighborhood, and neighborhoods in New York are mixed.
Sarah Schulman, in her book Gentrification of the Mind, talks about the West Village specifically, about how AIDS impacted in a way that I had never thought about. But so many people lived in, same-sex couples or singles, gay or lesbian people lived in rent-regulated apartments. And when they died,
Right.
if they had partners, the law was not in place that the partner could take the place.
Right.
And that really fundamentally changed who lived here. And a lot of people came here thinking, oh, I'm going to live in the West Village, I'm going to live in Greenwich Village, not knowing the role that they were playing.
Right.
And I see the same sort of thing with all these, I think they're all European, but it may not be true. All these young people, I guess with trust funds or whatever, who are able to pay these kinds of and have no understanding of the role that they have played. Right. What do you think about that?
I think that's a difficult human condition, let's say. I think we all, nobody wants to see themselves as the bad guy, and everybody needs a place to live, and people aren't necessarily that aware of what came before them, right? They're moving from Idaho or wherever they're coming, and they've heard that the West Village is a wonderful place. I mean, when I moved to New York in the 70s, it was this romantic, fabulous place, which we could never afford to live in. So I can understand somebody thinking like, oh, Greenwich Village, how wonderful. And
or
Williamsburg, and not necessarily putting two and two together, not thinking, oh, AIDS crisis, tens of thousands dead, they lived there, not doing that because they're sort of paying attention to their particular needs. So I think it's a little bit dangerous or a mistake to assume that everybody consciously walked into a situation where they knew they were, be able to take advantage of somebody else's misfortune. However, I also think, and I can't speak as much about the West Village because I feel like all that happened earlier, but let's say in Williamsburg, one of the really egregious aspects of living there in the late 90s and 2000s, and even now hearing about what's going on and seeing what's going on, it was this pretense, this phenomenon of these people moving in because of their trust fund, or because they were European and they wanted to have a pied-à-terre or whatever it might have been, and pretending that they were the same. And this is what really grates on me. If you don't have to have a job, and you have a whole lot of money, and you can buy an apartment that's as big as this room and pay $875,000 for it, then don't walk down the street acting like you're working at the deli or don't pretend that you're working class. Don't pretend that you are just sort of managing to live, because you're not. You're really rich. And this is what just drives me crazy about there. There's this like, oh no, man, it's all, we're all the same, we didn't do, we're no different. And you are. And if you live in what is essentially a gated community, then that's where you live.
I know that I live in the West Village and I can't afford to move. I mean, I live in a 6th floor walk-up and I cannot afford to move, and I'm grateful that I have the place.
Right.
But a lot of older people like myself are in this situation.
Right.
The quality of work. Do you think that?
The building.
Yes.
Oh my God. Unbelievable. I've done a lot of construction work. I've rebuilt every place I've lived in. And when I would go to these showing parties, I would look at, oh, the floor doesn't meet the wall, kind of. I mean, really bad. And now you can see online, people are writing in, to Curbed or wherever, saying, oh, every time it rains, it pours through my windows. And we talk about, will this be some strange Blade Runner environment in 20 years? Will all these people have moved away? What will happen when they try to resell? What's going to happen? I don't know, but they're really badly built.
And on another level, the quality of artistic work, the difference between an artist who, in this culture, in the United States, has to, unless they come from a trust fund background or taken care of financially, has to have a day job.
Right.
And then has to figure out how to balance the artistic work with the day job.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people running around that don't have to have a day job, and they have a really fabulous nightlife. And I just want to spend time about. Listen, it's not personal. It's not. They're not bad people. It's about. But looking at what about the artistic work?
Yeah.
Do you think it's impacted by this kind of gentrification?
Yes, well, of course, pretty much all the artists who lived in Williamsburg moved out to Bushwick. Many moved to Bushwick, but then to all kinds, a lot of other neighborhoods, wherever they could find a place they could afford. So I think there's a lot of good art being done by people in studios outside of Williamsburg. There are really good shows in Bushwick, and but I think overall, fewer and fewer young people are able to move to New York, and I don't encourage my students anymore to move to New York. When I go do a screening in Chicago, I did a screening in Chicago 2 years ago, and I went out for beers afterwards with all these people who were in the graduate program, and instead of saying, oh, I'm going to move to New York, what advice do you have? They all said, I really want to move to New York, but I feel like I can't. What's the deal? And I said, it's bad. Don't move to New York because how can you be a productive artist if you have to have 3 jobs, not 1? When we moved to New York in the late 70s, everybody I knew had 1 job. They were freelancing, like I did paste up and sort of production work, and it was freelance. So some period of the month I was working, I was earning a really decent salary, and then the rest of the time I had to work. And I don't see that for young people now in New York anymore. And it pains me. I love the city, and I think it has been the most fantastic, petri dish for all kinds of artistic, production. And I don't know that it's going to be like...
Because of the closeness of all the people.
Yeah.
Sort of the fission, the artistic aesthetic fission, yes.
And when we were, when I was younger, you didn't need to have the money to go to see a Broadway play. I mean, you'd be lucky if you got a free ticket and you got to go see something good. You didn't have to go to Broadway.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, all generated by the fact that you've made this film called Gut Renovation. And I wanted to ask you what you hope will happen with this film. It's not when I wrote the review, I said, this is not an arty film. It is very artistic because of who the filmmaker is. But what do you want to happen with this film?
Well, thank you. I think if it provokes discussion among people about what's happening where they live, then that would be a great thing. I am not a social activist filmmaker. I mean, I've done a lot of, activism in my life, and I believe in it, and I've made a lot of films, and I believe in filmmaking, and I think sometimes films can provoke discussion about whatever the topic is. And it seems that the way I, presented myself in the film, what I, the way I show myself in the film, gets people going. Like, I'm very direct in the film, and so I think maybe it gives people permission to speak very openly about how they feel, and I also think when I was finishing the editing was around the time that Occupy Wall Street was really at its height, and people were saying, this is really interesting because there has been so little discussion in the media about class in this country for so long, and now OWS is really getting it on the front page. People are really talking more openly about this economic divide in this country. And that'll be interesting with your film, because you're saying to hell with the rich, and you've got all this, stuff book that came before, agreeing with that. And I think, yes, good, because we do need to have much more discussion about this
One final
disparity.
question. What I love about the film is that it is very personal, and we've lived in a time of sort of subjective advocacy documentaries, which are sort of about love me, whatever the issue is, love me, like me, or you're a terrible person.
Right.
And you have modeled how to be personal in the context of a larger issue. Here it's about your home and development. And when you're working with students or young filmmakers or in discussions with other filmmakers, how do you broach that? It's not just about being narcissistic.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think, part of this is the product of spending the last 34 years making films, right? You learn, from your mistakes. So this is after many, many other attempts at combining, let's say, personal and the larger picture. And I'm glad if it succeeds with that. And what I tell my students is listen to other people, because I have always, from the very first film I made, I have always brought really serious people into the room. A friend who's a writer, who's a painter, who's a whatever they may be, but who will be very honest with me and very critical. And they've sat down and looked at it, and then they have said, that is really boring. That isn't funny. That's too sentimental. Whatever it may be. And then I say, well, what can I do to fix it? And so I think we can never know that kind of stuff entirely by ourselves. We are too full of ourselves, and so you need those cold outside eyes to look at the work. And so that's what I tell my students.
I always close with this question to filmmakers: is there a filmmaker that maybe people don't know about that you would like to just put into this frame here that people should look at and see their work, his or her work?
Oh, I think people know. Well, I would say, instead, I would answer that by saying one of the people who I bore in mind when I was putting this together was Agnes Varda, not only because of her early incredible narrative films, but also because of The Gleaners and I, which is from a few years ago, which I think is a great example of sort of the larger picture, what is gleaning historically, and her personal relationship to it. And I think it's just a perfect, example of that. And also, both Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf, two great Iranian filmmakers, because of their various ways of dealing with the combination of narrative and documentary, sort of fiction and documentary. And I think, particularly with this world now full of reality TV, which is totally unreal, I think it's very important for us to think about what film does in creating fiction, which I love, but also in documenting the real, and then what happens when those things intersect. And I find their films very rich source of, ideas about that.
Thank you very much, Sue Friedrich. The
Welcome.
film is called Gut Renovation. Will it be available online at all at some point?
Well, later. First it's going to be at Film Forum from March 6th through 12th, and it will show around, and then we're going to put out a DVD, with the specials and all of that, probably in the summer. And at some point we'll get online. But one of the problems with online now is that everybody thinks everything should be free. And everybody has to remember, whether it's music or film or anything else, that if you don't pay for art, artists will disappear. So that's one of our issues.
Thank you.